political bear nation ready to dive, where opinions spark and the debates thrive. Hold on tight, it's a passion.
Welcome to the first episode of Political Bear Nation. I'm your host, Brown Chubby Bear. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before I begin. I'm a first-generation Indian American. I was born in Connecticut. I traveled all around the world, including Eastern Europe. I lived in the Northeast for most of my childhood, and then I moved for a job to California. Now I reside in Southwest Florida. I'm a blue dot in a red state. Yes, I'm a liberal, but I'm also not your typical liberal Indian American. I was in a punk band in high school. I went to school for political science before I switched to graphic design and marketing. And I worked overseas for about 5 years, mostly in Eastern Europe, but I also traveled all over the world, including Asia. I'm tatted up, and I even have an American flag on my arm. I love this country, but I don't recognize the country I once believed was the best country on earth. And that's what this podcast is going to be about. This podcast is all about what's going on in America, and I'm going to bring you some details that you may not have heard in regular publications. With that out of the way, thank you for watching the first episode, and let's get started with today's first topic. I assure you, I'll talk more about myself and why I call myself Brown Chubby Bear in future episodes, but for now, let's start with today's topic. Why did Trump blink? So, if you're listening or watching this podcast, it is probably no surprise to you that Trump reversed most of the tariffs that he put in place yesterday. For some reason, Trump has this insane idea that trade imbalances are bad for the economy. Now, for the uninitiated, trade deficits are actually not inherently bad, especially for the United States. The American economy is based on consumption. Nearly 70% of our GDP is based on the consumption of products. We are not an export country. Only 10 to 12% of our GDP is based on exports, and no amount of tariffs will change that. For the United States, a trade deficit is actually a good thing. This means we are able to import more than we produce, and that keeps our economy growing. Trump's belief that every country should buy as much stuff from us as we buy from them is absolutely ludicrous. That's not how the global market works. Frankly, that's not how any market works. What's crazier than that is that even far-right lunatic Andrew Tate understands this concept. It's crazy. Let's just take a quick listen to what he said about trade and why Trump's tariff plan is just insane.
North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, and South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world. Why? The people are the same. Well, the idea behind it is actually quite simple. The North Koreans had an absolute self-sufficiency, and they didn't want to rely on any other country for anything, which sounds quite smart, but it turns out to be a massive hindrance. And the South decided to trade and open up and deal with all other countries. When you trade, means that you spend all of your time focusing on the one thing you are good at. So South Korea became very good at microchips. They didn't need to be good at making clothes. And if they needed clothes, they'd give microchips, the thing they were good at, for the things they were bad at in return. Imagine you wanted to be completely self-sufficient and you had to make your own clothes and grow your own food and build your own house. You're going to stay poor. This is an extremely important concept for you guys at home to understand.
It's insane that Andrew Tate may be more knowledgeable about the global economy and trade than Donald Trump. So again, why did Trump blink? Now, there were massive protests on April 5th. I took part in the hands-off protests, and they estimate up to 5 million people nationwide came out to protest. Many came out to protest Trump's injustices and about not touching Social Security or Medicare, but many also came out because their 401ks were being robbed. You also had avid Trump supporters like Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, Dave Portnoy from Barstool, billionaire Bill Ackman, and senators Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, John Kennedy, Chuck Grassley, Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and even Elon Musk himself said Trump's tariffs were unnecessary, blowing up the economy. Nonetheless, Trump and propaganda Barbie Caroline Leavitt said it's not a negotiation and the tariffs were permanent.
This is not a negotiation.
It's not the kind of thing you can negotiate away.
I don't think there's any chance they're going to
that President Trump's going to back off his tariffs.
The president made it clear yesterday this is not a negotiation.
Trump posted this morning, "My policies will never change."
In that same vein, we have had more than 75 countries from around the world reach out to President Trump and his team here at the White House to negotiate better trade deals for the American worker.
So why did Trump pause the tariffs 1 week after he declared that America were victims and that these tariffs were not a negotiation? The bond market. Let me explain. Because most people would have thought that vaporizing $104,000 from the average retirement account would have been reason enough. But that wasn't the reason at all. Let me break it down for the uninitiated. Government bonds are debt securities issued by a government like the United States to finance public spending and obligations that include defense spending, Medicare, everything we need to pay for things that we can't afford through the collection of tax revenue. Basically, that's how we borrow money. U.S. Treasury bonds have been regarded as risk-free for well over 40, 50 years. And they are risk-free investments because the U.S. government has a near zero likelihood of defaulting on its debt obligations. But as a tariff deadline got closer and closer, a sell-off occurred. Then bond yields surged, and they climbed above 4.5%, which is something that hasn't happened for decades. Investors have demanded high returns for the higher risk. Yes, they looked at bonds as now having higher risk. Now, that means that the borrowing costs for the American government, businesses, and consumers would be higher, further increasing our chances of entering a recession. But here's the real scare. Trump had placed an additional 25% tariff on Japan. Japan is the largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds. They account for over $1 trillion in U.S. securities. Most people think it's China, but it's not. They are number two. They hold about $760 billion in treasuries. Now, if they both started selling off their bonds, it would have threatened the position of the dollar. If major foreign holders of U.S. Treasury bonds, such as Japan or China, were to sell off their holdings significantly, it would have profound implications for the petrodollar system and the broader U.S. economy. Now, the petrodollar system relies on oil exporting nations reinvesting their surplus dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds, something that has happened for decades. A sell-off would reduce this recycling process, weakening one of the key mechanisms that support the U.S. dollar dominance. Now, I apologize if that sounded like a bunch of economic mumbo-jumbo, but just remember this. All you need to know is that the bond market has been considered the best way for governments and investors, billionaires, hedge funds, etc., to stash money even when global financial markets are collapsing, right? When everything else goes to hell, people put their money in U.S. treasuries. But Trump's actions actually make buying bonds a risky investment. Now, I'm glad Trump blinked, and I thank whoever convinced him to pause the tariffs. But it's important to know how close one man was to sending the entire world into a depression, not just a recession. I'm not saying it would have happened overnight, but if the tariffs had been in place for a few months or maybe a little longer, this would have been a global disaster. Trump has permanently changed how the world views American leadership. Canada is now aligning themselves with Europe. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that Canada's old relationship with the United States, and I quote, is based on deepening integration of our economies and trade security and military cooperation is over. Europe is debating ending the spending of nearly $450 billion of American weapons, which they purchase annually, because they believe that buying weapons from the United States could be a national security issue, actually a European security issue. India, who chose not to purchase American F-35s and instead purchased 26 European Rafale Marine jets. South Korea and India, who have had geopolitical issues with China, have now agreed to work on a trilateral trade agreement. Trump has made natural enemies into allies, and all of these countries are choosing to divest themselves from the American market as much as possible. And just before I started recording this podcast, I just read that the European Union is working with China to reduce the cost of Chinese EVs into the EU. And it's going to be a bilateral agreement. So the entire world is finding ways not to work with the United States. So why are they so scared? We elected Trump, not once, but twice. We elected a madman to the highest office in the land, knowing that he wanted to start a trade war. I know it's a lot to take in for a first episode, but it's important to realize just how close we came to a global financial disaster. And the world wants to make sure that does not happen in the future. Now, the messed up part is we may all have to go through this again in 90 days. So while we have Trump and his cronies calling him master of the deal,
absolutely brilliant move.
Brilliant, not only economically, politically, and it was good for the American worker.
He's negotiator in chief. He's landing the plane. It's the master of the deal.
I mean, you're watching the art of the deal in real time here.
Many of you in the media clearly missed the art of the deal.
you know the truth. Just remember, the Republicans have chosen to give Trump this power. They could have stopped it at any time. And yes, there was a Republican bill with 7 GOP members who backed it. But now he's being praised as a hero for stopping a crisis that he alone created. Please subscribe to the Political Bear Nation YouTube channel and check out our audio version on Spotify. It will be available on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else in just a few days. But right now, the podcast is on YouTube and Spotify. If you think I brought you something different, please share this show with a friend. I plan on having 2 or 3 episodes a week, possibly more, and in the future, I'll even have guests. Until then, this is Brown Chubby Bear from Political Bear Nation.
In the land of the bone where the stories collide, political bears on an untamed ride, roaring through truths, the left and the right, setting the stage for a wild insight. Political bears.